Welcome to today's Rockler demo. The popularity of projects that combine wood and epoxy has exploded over the past several years, and as a result, so have the number of epoxies and pigments that are more available. Now, we've shared several projects over the past few months, but today we're going to focus on 7 mistakes that are commonly made that can ruin your epoxy project. Let's get to it. Mistake number 1, going too big too soon. Working with epoxy isn't terribly difficult, but there is a learning curve. So rather than start with a huge project like a big river table that requires gallons of epoxy, start with something smaller that's easier to manage, something like these coasters. The process is basically the same as it would be on a large river table, but it's a much more manageable way to learn, and you won't be wasting hundreds of dollars in materials if anything goes wrong. Mistake number 2. You choose the wrong epoxy. With all the new cool epoxies that are out there, we agree it can be confusing. So we've created this handy chart to help make things easier. It's basically a guide that includes the products we carry and all the major considerations you should look at to pick the right epoxy for your project, such as the casting depth, which is how deep you want to pour the epoxy. The reason casting thickness is important is you need to choose an epoxy that's intended for the depth you're going to pour. For example, you wouldn't want to use a deep pour epoxy to fill a shallow crack. It would eventually work, but it will take a long time to cure. On the other end of the spectrum, the maximum thickness that you should pour a tabletop epoxy is only a 1/4 inch. Mistake number 3, your form or mold wasn't built, sealed, or leveled properly. When you're building forms to pour epoxy, remember these 3 things. First, make sure your form is well supported underneath. Epoxy can get heavy, so if you have a large area, you don't want it to sag. Second, make sure you carefully seal all the edges of the form. It's important to coat the faces of the form with house tape to help the form release. But it's also, if not more important, to seal all the seams with silicone. Epoxy is like water. If there's even the slightest opportunity for it to escape, it will. Best case, that might be a small puddle on your shop floor. Or worse, it could be gallons of sticky, partially cured epoxy covering your shop floor. And if you're filling a void, pre-seal the inside of the void with penetrating epoxy. And finally, make sure your form is level in all directions. Otherwise, when you're nearing the top of the pour, you may have epoxy running out of one side and ending up shallow on the other side. Mistake number 4. Your epoxy or your shop are too hot or too cold. Mixing epoxy is a chemical reaction that is temperature sensitive, and it works best if the temperature of both the epoxy and your shop is between 70 and 80 degrees. So you may need an air conditioner or a heater to get your space set before you start mixing and pouring. Mistake number 5. You mix the wrong amount of epoxy. Now, I know math isn't everyone's thing, but it's important that you take the time to calculate how much epoxy you're going to need for the pour. We've included a link to a handy calculator from Moss Epoxies that makes this really easy. You do want to mix a little extra, but you don't want to waste money mixing way too much epoxy. Another way to make the math a little easier if you're doing a deep pour is to make multiple pours in layers. That limits your risk of error. But if you do make multiple pours, make sure you know your formula. Otherwise, the color could change from layer to layer. Mistake number 6, over-mixing. You're gonna get small bubbles when you mix epoxy. And a small number of these bubbles is fine because they're going to rise to the surface and pop as you're pouring. The key is to not overmix or mix too quickly, as you see in this example. That creates microbubbles and makes your epoxy cloudy, something that you cannot fix. If you're mixing less than a gallon, I recommend just using a mixing stick and stir slow and steady, scrape the sides, scrape the bottom. And if you're mixing more than that and you choose to use a mixing paddle on a drill, again, slow and steady. Keep the drill on a slow speed, move it around, get the sides and the bottom. Mistake number 7, rushing your final surface prep and finishing. This applies to all woodworking projects. You work so hard to build the project, you can see the finish line, and then you rush to finish and ruin the project. Take your time on the finishing process. When it comes to sanding, start with a 60 or 80 grit, work your way up through the grits to 600. Unless you're going to apply a tabletop epoxy as your top coat, then stop at 220 so that it can adhere. And then if you're not using tabletop finish, it can react differently with the wood and the epoxy. So I like to wipe on a finish, wipe off the excess, let it cure, buff it, repeat the process, and eventually the finish will even out. So there you have it, 7 mistakes to avoid when you're doing projects that involve pouring epoxy. There are a lot more tips that apply to specific epoxy projects, but these mistakes are common to just about any project that involves pouring epoxy. I hope these helped you if you're considering doing a project with epoxy in the future. I'm Dan Carey with Rockler and Woodworkers Journal. Thanks for watching.